introduce to you Dr. Ray Vaughn, who is a professional geologist and environmental scientist. And he's going to talk to us, and Stephanie Redmond with Clean. And they are both going to present to us on risks of the salt mine under Cayuga Lake and what municipalities should know.
All right, you have me up to share screen. Okay, let me go ahead and get this started. Oh, it's in my way. Okay, here we go. Okay, Ray and everyone, you can see that?
Yes, very good. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, just go
Thank
ahead.
you, Ray, for the introduction. And I also want to thank Liz Thomas for arranging this, even though she couldn't be with us today. So you've got our information here. And next slide, please. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with the setup of the Cayuga salt mine. It occupies the bedrock valley in which Cayuga Lake sits. And the bedrock valley is, very old, has been eroded out by rivers and glaciers. And underneath, at the very bottom of this diagram in the light blue layer, are the layers of rock salt that are hundreds of millions of years old. They're interbedded with layers of shale and dolostone. And the mine is at the very deepest part of this collection of salt layers. So it's at the bottom of the medium blue band, roughly 2,000 feet below lake level or 1,600 feet below sea level. Next, please. So what we're talking about today is what I'm calling the perforated salt under the lake. As a couple centuries ago, the beds of salt under the lake had not been disturbed for hundreds of millions of years. And as a result of that, there were no big cavities in the salt beds that water could enter. However, mining has created a 6-mile long cavity, maybe even a little bit longer than that now. It's been kept mostly dry, especially in the active areas of the mine. Water has leaked into and accumulated in some of the older areas of the mine. And now in red, we're getting to the important point. Additional areas of water storage, in other words, brine disposal, it'll almost certainly be permanent disposal rather than temporary storage, are now being proposed within the mine. And the question is whether these are risks that need attention and evaluation. Next, please. So there's a couple of different but related questions here. Pros and cons of mining under the lake are certainly an issue that I'm not going to focus on in a lot of detail today, but the question of whether brine from mine leakage water should be stored and disposed of in the active number 6 mine level should be allowed without undergoing substantial review. And some of the relevant background in this includes the role of New York State, which serves as the owner of the lake bed and the underlying mineral rights, but it also acts as the regulator. So that does complicate things a little bit, New York State's dual roles here. We also have the important lessons learned from the collapse and flooding of the Axo or Retzoff salt mine near Geneseo in 1994. The flooding actually extended over about 15 months, so the complete flooding didn't occur until about 1995 with a very, very large salt mine that is roughly the same size as the Cayuga salt mine is today. And then the other piece of background information is on the question of how subsidence gradually squeezes brine out of a flooded salt mine. Next, please. So subsidence is a very predictable occurrence above a mine. What I'm talking about is the fact that underground cavities, such as salt mines and coal mines, slowly deform and squeeze shut. In the Cayuga mine, where they're using room and pillar mining, they leave pillars of salt to support the mine ceiling, roughly 10 feet high. And then they mine out the salt between the pillars. The weight of the overlying rock is large enough to cause the salt pillars to deform. So year after year, decade by decade, the pillars become shorter and fatter. And at the same time, new fractures are forming and old fractures are shifting within the overlying rock. And the net result is that the mine is squeezing shut very gradually as the mine ceiling and land surface sag downward into the cavity of the empty mine. Next, please. So this next diagram shows, for coal mine actually, but it's very similar for salt mine. The mine itself is down at the bottom of the drawing where you see the words floor lift. And the empty space of that mine is now causing what they're showing as a caving in of some of the directly overlying bedrock. And then there are bending and to some extent breaking and shearing effects going on above that, extending up to the land surface. So for any empty mine cavity, this is a process that may take hundreds of years. So it's usually not a fast phenomenon unless there's a mine collapse, as happened at the Axo or Rutzoff mine. But the net effect is that the empty mine does not stay still. It is very slowly but gradually caving in on itself. Next, please. So brine squeezes out of a flooded mine. That happens regardless of whether the flooding was from slow leakage into the empty mine or accidental collapse, such as happened at the Axo mine, or deliberate flooding. And deliberate flooding is sometimes used as a procedure when a mine is commercially closed to slow down, but can't actually stop the gradual subsidence that I've been talking about. And the brine squeeze out also happens regardless of whether the mine was flooded with fresh water or with brine. If the mine was flooded with fresh water, that fresh water will simply dissolve salt from the pillars and become brine. So regardless of whether it goes in fresh or salty, it'll come back out as brine. And fully saturated brine is a very salty solution, much saltier than ocean water, for example. And the experience at the collapsed flooded Axo salt mine was that the brine that squeezed out didn't stay down at the depth of the mine. That was a bit of a surprise. That didn't stay down, particularly given its relatively high density of about 20% denser than fresh water. The brine emerging from the Axo mine rose partway up to the surface through rock fractures in the collapse zone. And you saw in that diagram I showed you for subsidence how rock fractures tended to form and shift in the collapse zone above the mine. So the question that I'm addressing today is primarily whether similar upward brine migration from a flooded Cayuga mine would reach and mix with Cayuga Lake. Next, please. So the mining and flooding risks include the possible risks from the lake becoming saltier. The salt itself, in other words, would produce the impacts. So we're talking about health and ecological risks due to the higher sodium and or chloride, but also interference with the natural seasonal turnover of the lake, which would cause one or more anoxic dead zones at the bottom of the lake. And there may also be some negative tourism and community character effects that I'll talk about. At the same time, the subsidence itself, to the extent that it reaches the land surface, can sometimes cause problems with buildings that would undergo uneven settling, particularly if they're near the edge of the subsidence zone, where one side of a building might settle deeper than the other side. So a matter of an inch or two of settling is certainly going to be a problem for many buildings. So that's one of the long-term risks that may need to be evaluated. So my view is that evaluating such risks should be done carefully and methodically. And an environmental impact statement under the State Environmental Quality Review Act, or SECRA, would certainly be the type of review that I would think should be done. And as I mentioned, New York State has this ownership role for the lake beds. They also have a stewardship role. In my view, they should not just take the attitude, oh, we'll just wait and see what happens. In my view, studies and careful review are needed. So Stephanie will take the next few slides to talk about some of the risks due to saltiness and lake turnover.
Thank you, Ray. So the mine cavity is big enough to hold about 10 to 15 billion gallons. The lake is about 2.5 trillion, or about 200 times larger, and is about 40 milligrams of per liter of chloride. That's the lake's current level. We do a lot of studies with Cayuga Lake Environmental Action now. We've been testing regularly, and that's what we find. The Speedies permit that allows for the shoreline or surface operations outfall is about 40,000 milligrams per liter. They also have a couple of unregulated seeps, one we affectionately call the hillside ditch, and we found that an exceedance of 90,000 milligrams per liter. Mine flooding, either accidentally or intentionally, with brine, either fresh or with brine into the mine, either bringing brine or fresh water into the mine. And that flooding of fresh water will dissolve the salt pillars and become very salty brine, much saltier than ocean water. Fully saturated brine has a specific gravity of 1.2. That's compared to freshwater, and is about 26.5% salt by weight, or about 318,000 milligrams per liter salt, or 193 milligrams liter of chloride. And so what is the risk of that mixing with the lake? And as you heard Ray say, over the course of several hundred years, hopefully, there will be subsidence and mine closure. So either way, that will have to go somewhere. Now, it would be great if we had, studies done by the DEC or at least an external agency studying the limnological effects of a mine collapse, but there is not, that we know of, anything like that happening. We've had some expert advice saying that if there were a mine collapse and all of that brine or saturated, salt were to release into the lake, we'd be looking at around 950 milligrams per liter of salt. And so these are a number of amphibian fish and invertebrate plant and algae that are affected by chloride concentrations. But I really want to focus in on this part where you're looking at Daphnia, which is zooplankton, minnows, worms, brown trout, rainbow trout. These are all highly sensitive to higher levels of chloride, and they will be affected if there is that sort of brine seeping into the lake. It also affects the natural turnover of through the seasons. So in the spring, you see, the regular mixing cycle. In the summer, it'll be warmer at the surface and colder at the bottom. Fall, again, you'll see a mixing throughout the lake. And then in the winter time, with the ice over, or at least colder surface temperatures, it'll be colder on top and warmer on the bottom. So this infographic, I think, is really interesting if we think of, this is sort of zero. We see the temperature increases the stratification. And if you have more salt, that increases the stratification more. So when the ice off in the spring, usually you'd want that circulation. And after the ice off, the turbulent forces are greater than the stabilizing forces. However, if you have stratification, you're going to delay the salt mixing, or in some cases, as in Green Lake, which is a popular recreational spot near Syracuse, you have permanent stratification. Now, this isn't due to road salt. The Syracuse Formation at the top is the predominant geological formation in the area, and in the bedrock. And that has the mixolimnion. It's characterized by high levels of oxygen and sunlight penetration. Chemocline is the boundary between the mixolimnion and the deeper monomolimnion. The Vernon shale or gypsum in the monomolimnium area it has a sulfate mineral. And so that is actually what causes the stratification in that lake. And the increased stability during both stratification periods will limit vertical transport of the water column, and it causes increased hypolemnic oxygen and depletion of decreased habitat, fish species, and decreased movement of nutrients across the thermocline. The Finger Lakes are widely recognized as a tourist destination based on the lake's beautiful clean waters and hospitalities and wineries, and we have to worry about if this reputation is at risk. So I'll go back to you, Ray.
Okay. So this question of reputation is something for communities that each one will want to decide on its own, I think. Next slide, please. So this slide deals with a couple of things that might be within communities' power if they indeed want to explore their ability to protect the Finger Lakes more than is currently the case. Particularly regarding this question of whether in-mine salt storage should be allowed as is currently being proposed by Cargill. So the first bullet point here deals with home rule provisions, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, that provides localities with some local power. May or may not be relevant here. That's for individual municipalities to decide. But there's also the provision of the State Environmental Quality Review Act, or CWIO, that recognizes the right of communities to establish their own principles of community character. These are principles that define what a community's residents hold valuable and how the community wants to grow and prosper based on these. And one of the handouts that Roxy sent earlier today to each of you, I think, the first one, handout number 1, provides some details on how, some real nuts and bolts on how this community character provision of CWIO works. The handout number 1 actually comes from an issue in Seneca Lake that I was involved in several years ago. This question of whether propane storage should be allowed in salt caverns near the shore of Seneca Lake. It took a long time to get a clear decision on that, but this handout number 1 is DEC's final decision on why propane on the shore of Seneca Lake would not be a proper plan for them to approve. And there are several pages in there. It's indicated actually in the title, in the name of the document, which pages, I think it's from page 10 or 11 onward. There are several pages on how community character played into this decision by DEC not to allow a incompatible use on Seneca Lake. So to the extent you're interested in this, you might look at the handout number 1 to see how the application of community character principles might work for your community. Next, please. There's also an upcoming opportunity, probably within the next several weeks, to the extent that municipalities are interested in submitting comments on the mine operator's the mine operator's proposal for brine storage within the mine. And what handout number 2 consists of is New York DEC's notice to Cargill, a notice of so-called incomplete application, or NOIA, which called the project for brine storage a major project. DEC, is usually not subject to too much hyperbole, but they do consider this to be a major project that's going to take a closer look than some of the routine renewals of Cargill's mining permit. So the questions the DEC raises in this NOIA document look at this question of what would be a gradual process of irreversible flooding. So DEC asked for additional information before this approved. As I said, this is part of the handout number 2 that Roxy sent. And what's upcoming based on this handout number 2 is that a public comment period will be forthcoming with notice to be provided in the Ithaca Journal, I think. It's to be provided in the newspaper of record for the town that's affected, which I think in this case is Ulysses. But in any case, there should be a notice about public comment coming forth fairly soon in the Ithaca Journal, saying that the comments will be taken on this proposal to store or dispose of brine in the number 6 level of the salt mine. So one reasonable and relevant comment in my mind might express something like the need for an environmental impact statement that evaluates where the brine squeezed out of a flooded mine would go and what the effects would be. Next, please. So almost done here. Next slide. So the main theme of what I've been saying is that mine closure, at least in my opinion, needs attention, such as an environmental impact statement. Deliberate flooding of the mine, either now or after it's closed, may reduce the rate at which the mine squeezes shut. The squeezing shut is, of course, due to the weight of the overlying rock, and having water in the mine is actually more of a retardant to mine collapse than just having air in the mine. But it simply slows the process. It does not stop the much larger weight of the overlying rock from gradually pushing downward, creating the subsidence effects that I showed you, and squeezing brine back out of the mine. So deliberate flooding of the mine, even though it has some short-term benefits, let's say, it would fill the brine, as I've talked about, as the water in the mine dissolves salt from the pillars, and the brine would then be gradually squeezed back out. And based on the actual experience, it would rise, possibly affecting the lake. That's part of what an ongoing study should look at. So a study should also look at whether there are possibilities of the mine being sealed dry, such that it could stay dry forever. That seems like a tall order, given the fact that water will find ways in quite often, and especially with new cavities forming and old cavities being rearranged by subsidence. An effort, in year 1, let's say, after mine closure, might very well seal the mine dry, but as years go by through year 10, 20, and so on, the ongoing subsidence will almost certainly open up new pathways requiring either ongoing work to keep it dry or a gradual decision that's going to flood regardless of what we do. Another option might be, and this is something that the study should look at, is whether a mine could be backfilled with non-toxic material. But given the size of the mine, many miles long, 10-foot ceiling, 1,000 or more feet wide, this would be a huge amount of backfill material. Even as clean sand, for example, that's probably a tall order to expect that either the state or the mine operator would agree to import backfill that would be non-toxic and would substantially stop the collapse process that's going to happen over decades and centuries. And then finally, who takes long-term responsibility if indeed there are issues? Can this be enforced over decades and centuries? And I don't want to claim that there's 100% certainty that there would be issues due to the saltiness or the effects on lake turnover. But these are questions that really should be looked at in our view. Next, please. So just in summary, as we talked about, the possible risks do include health and ecological risks, interference with the natural seasonal turnover, and possibly, that's for communities to decide, negative tourism, community character effects, if the water of the Finger Lakes, particularly Cayuga Lake, were to become degraded by salt and brine leaking out of a closed mine many years prior. Subsidence also is something that needs to be kept in mind. Some monitoring has been proceeding on this, but this is an effort that would need to proceed for decades to keep track of subsidence. Not that there could be too much done about it once it's happening, but identifying whether it's mine related or due to some other cause may be useful. And then finally, as I've said, an evaluation that's careful and methodical, such as an EIS, would be an appropriate review. And as I mentioned, New York State has a role there as well. It would not be, in my opinion, a responsible position to say, oh, we'll just wait and see, and then act surprised a few decades later when salt effects do start showing up. So with that, I think next slide, I think, invites questions, and Stefan and I will try to answer what we could here.
Thank you very much for that talk. It doesn't sound like there are any easy answers. Are there other questions before I just launch in with one?
I might add one more little pertinent fact, and that is Cayuga Lake, the Cayuga Lake mine is not the only salt mine in the Great Lakes Basin that's underwater. There's also a salt mine near Cleveland that's under Lake Erie, and a salt mine near Goderich, Ontario in Canada that's under Lake Huron. So those also face some of these same questions. But I think given the much larger volumes of water above them in the larger lakes Erie and Huron, that the impacts would be greatly diluted, literally and figuratively.
I can't see it. Oh, go ahead, Kent. I can see your hand.
So when does the salt concentration in the lake start to affect the potable quality of the water?
That's a good question. I, being in Buffalo, I'm not entirely familiar with that. Seneca Lake actually has higher saltiness than Cayuga Lake. And I don't know offhand whether the water that, say, the Bolton Point plant in Cayuga Lake treats, whether they would need to add additional ion exchange or other methods to try to bring down the sodium. But
I can respond to that a little bit.
Steve's also here, so he could probably
Oh, is
respond to
he?
that
Oh,
too.
I will let Steve
Not to put Steve
respond
on
to
the
that.
spot, but
That's great. I don't see him.
Steve, he's here.
he's here, but maybe not here.
He might not be sitting there right at this perfect moment.
Yeah.
Right.
So for people on severely restricted salt diets, the lake is already above that level, and I think that might be 15 or 20. I just looked up, I looked up the 2022 water quality report for Bolton Point, and that's the one I landed on. And they have 36 as opposed to 40 for the concentration. So basically that's the same thing that Clean is finding now in the lake. I think the next health level is around 270 milligrams per liter. It's pretty high. Um, but
Roxy,
they're all, yes.
sorry, this is Mary. You are correct.
Oh,
You're correct on those numbers.
great. Thank you, Mary. Yes, I know there's 2 other health department people on here. But then that's just for drinking water. There's also sensitivity for the fisheries or other aquatic organisms, or the plants, and that's a whole different set of numbers that I'm not aware of. I don't know if there's anyone on here who knows those regulations or sensitivities.
I mean, I shared that infographic that had the different species at higher levels. That was like if in case of a mine collapse or, you know, all the brine seeping out.
And I think we're looking at 2 different possibilities at least here. One is that there might be lake-wide elevations of salt that would be of concern. The other is that there might be hot spots extending over several square miles within the lake, surrounding a point of leakage that would have the much higher salt, with the rest of the lake being less affected.
So there's also, I mean, the lake does empty into the St. Lawrence, right? So won't that salinity change with time?
Well, you've got 2 competing factors going on, I think, within the lake. One is the lake turnover in a different sense time. In other words, the time for the water to be replaced in Cayuga Lake is about 10 years. There's been another estimate of about 18, but I think 10 years is the current estimate, is how long it takes for any water that enters the lake via rain or stream flow to be flushed out on average. Once you get downstream into Lake Ontario, I think then the dilution, which shouldn't be regarded as a pure solution, of course, but that will really reduce the salinity concentration of any water that enters Lake Ontario.
I have a question. Could they replace the salt pillars with concrete pillars? So if it did fill up with water, we wouldn't lose those pillars?
That's certainly an option. I was talking about what would probably be a pretty extreme expense for backfilling the entire mine. The mine pillars are maybe 40% of the underground space, let's say. So we're talking about an awful lot of concrete as well. These are just the sorts of things I think could and should be monetized or compared in some reasonable way to see whether the long-term protection merits such expensive measures or not.
Thank you.
Could you pressurize the cavity?
Interesting idea. If water leaks in, the air should bubble back out if you pressurize the cavity.
Yeah, we just have a bubbling Lake Cayuga.
Yeah. I mean, what you would need to pressurize it to actually stop any subsidence would be the so-called lithostatic pressure, which is the pressure exerted by given about 2,000 feet of water, a 2,000-foot head of water. Multiply that by about 2.65 for the extra density of rock overhead. Actually, part of it is water overhead in Cayuga Lake, but it'd be a pretty high pressure. Up in the thousands of PSI. It would certainly not allow any workers to enter to investigate leaks, outward leaks or something like that.
Okay, I have a question. And I'm going to say it the example mine that you referenced in the talk a couple times, did it happen? Was it catastrophic? Did it happen over time? Are both of those possibilities?
It was catastrophic in one sense, although fortunately nobody died, which is good. Miners were not in the mine at the time. There was a late night collapse of part of the roof which very quickly, maybe, within seconds, propagated all the way to the surface. And there, the surface was land rather than a lake. So as the collapse zone propagated upward, it did start to drain immense amounts of groundwater in the Genesee Valley where the mine was located.
Oh,
But it did not have a water source as large as Cayuga Lake above it.
Ray,
So
if,
there were actually two collapses. One was a few weeks later. So two rather similar collapses, the first of which registered on seismographs around New York State. And I think the second one probably did as well. Go ahead, Ken, sorry.
if, I know we don't have a lot of seismic activity around here, but would a seismic event, should it happen, create a catastrophe of the mine? I mean, you could imagine that you'd create cracks and fissures that would cause an inrush of water and other debris into the mine.
That is a concern, especially given that the fractures already exist and are being freshly formed and also evolving due to subsidence. An earthquake would provide enough seismic shock to endanger the existing balance between staying in place and falling down into the mine itself.
All the more reason for an environmental impact statement.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Can you hear me?
yes, yes.
Yes.
Go ahead.
So if there's an entrance to get into this mine and it fills, would that like flood the area? Like, why wouldn't the water just keep coming out the entrance to the mine? It would blow it out and just flood the town or whatever where they enter. I mean, why would it wouldn't just fill that hole and stop? If there's an outlet, it would just, with all that pressure, you think it would just flood the whole surrounding town where they enter, right?
Well, keep in mind that the pressure decreases as you go upward. So if you're standing in a puddle, there's very little pressure at the bottom of the puddle compared to the pressure at the top of the puddle. They're essentially the same pressure. But when you go down 2,000 feet or 1,600 feet, either one, you still have, very low atmospheric pressure at the top of the water column through the collapse zone, for example. But progressively increasing pressure as you go down further and further. So there wouldn't be enough pressure to force it above existing lake level that I'm aware of. So what would be happening essentially is a rearrangement of lake water in the instance of a catastrophic collapse where you had a big void or big connection to the surface open up all at once. About 1/200th, in other words, about 0.5% of Lake Cayuga would find its way down through this collapse zone if it were a large enough collapse, and would actually lower the lake level by an inch or two, perhaps. So in a sense, it would take water rather than driving it up toward the surface in any of the villages or beachfront homes that are on Cayuga Lake.
And then it would mix and we would see the effects over time as those waters mixed.
Yes, in other words, flooding, this is what happened at the Axel mine. The mine flooded. As I said, it took about 15 months for that to happen. There were a number of efforts by the mine operator there to try to grout the leakage pathways, but none of that worked. The flow of water was just too great, even though what they were draining was aquifers rather than an overlying lake.
Briny, and that would brine water would go to the surface.
So how does it work that you would have hot spots? Can you explain that to us? What would that result
When I'm
from?
using the word hot, of course, I'm referring to high salinity rather than
Right.
high temperature. And what I'm saying is that the leakage back out of a mine that is filled with brine and then is starting to have the brine squeezed out due to subsidence, that leakage pathway will come into the lake at certain points. So one of the communities that say up toward the north end of Cayuga Lake would not feel the effects at all, or would not feel the effects as intensely as a community that was right near the point of escape where the brine was being squeezed out of the mine. So what I'm saying is that you could use the term hotspot to refer to what the nearby effects would be, where the salt concentration is very high at a certain point in the lake and much less high as you go further away from that. But the amount of salt that's still available underground is not going to be a limiting factor. You know, even if the full amount of brine that's in the mine at a given point is all squeezed out, there still may be additional water flow through the remaining space within the mine to start dissolving new pillars as well. Or I shouldn't say pillars, but just the end mine salt that is still remaining on the floor of the roof and in the pillars themselves.
So whatever, we already, no matter what happens moving forward, we already need to figure out how to address what will happen in the future with subsidence of the cave, the mine.
That's
Yeah.
my view. That shouldn't just be wait and see, but some degree of study, even though the results are never going to be completely conclusive.
Sure.
You know, on the question, for example, will there be a sudden collapse versus a slow leakage? That's a tough call that would require some very detailed rock mechanics study, you know, beyond what I'm capable of doing within my expertise. But there's certainly world experts who could contribute to such a study to help identify what the likely near term is, whether it's going to be a collapse or just slow leakage. But regardless of which of those occurs, then this question of where the brine ends up going is the one that needs to be looked at. Lori?
Hi, I've enjoyed the talk, by the way, it was very good. The question back on the pillars that somebody had already mentioned about replacing them with concrete pillars. So why couldn't they just do that? Is there any regulations on that says that if they put up these pillars, I mean, at least it would doubly stabilize it? You're not going to fill the mine completely, but at least there would be more support.
If the question is whether New York State has the power to require Cargill to do that, I think the answer is a novel one that has not yet been addressed. So I don't know. If we're talking about whether New York State could do it, yes. I mean, that would be a large state expense, but it is state land that has been effectively leased to Cargill for a long time. It's actually done under a so-called consent order rather than a lease, but either way, Cargill has New York State permission to use New York State underground or underwater lands to do this mining.
Be nice if they could. Be nice if they could also support it, so the after effects maybe not be so great or be delayed even longer. You know, I don't know.
Yeah, no, very good. Very good idea.
Having the first salt lake on the East Coast does not sound like a great tourist attraction to me.
No.
Well, so I have
Thank
two
you.
questions. So a sense of, is there any way to have a sense of time on this? Of course, catastrophes can happen at any time. We can have an earthquake at any time, plate shift, whatever. But is there, in general, based on the geology where we are, is there a sense of how fragile that is, or how much it's moving, or the depth, or what kind of buffer we have, what kind of rate of subsistence? I guess outside of a catastrophe, is there a way to know what kind of rate of subsistence we should normally expect in our area?
There are at least two mines that we need to be looking at more closely to get some of the answers to those questions. One is the Axo mine, the one that collapsed in the Geneseo area, which unfortunately is no longer being monitored. There was a settlement agreement between the mine owner and New York State about 12 years ago. And part of that is that there's no more monitoring of what the underground brine movement is doing there. The other mine that has received very little attention to date is the Himrod mine that operated on Seneca Lake. And that one, there's some lack of clarity, I think, as to whether high chloride levels around the Himrod mine are due to old salt practices, old salt disposal dating back to when the mine actually operated, or whether some of the high salinity seen near the Hemorrhoid mine may be attributed to ongoing leakages occurring right now. So I don't have a very clear answer on that without saying we need to look at more of the nearby mines on Seneca Lake and also in the Genesee Valley.
When was the Seneca Lake mine closed?
In my understanding, it was in the 1980s.
That's fair. I was asking you a crystal ball question. So my other question is, you mentioned experts around the world. Are there safety practices currently being used or mine closure practices being used anywhere that reduce the chance of catastrophe for this sort of mining, that would make it something slow and century paced, you know, that would not dramatically change the environment?
Well, I think the practice of flooding closed mines, commercially closed, or mines that have gone out of business, the practice of flooding is definitely one of the ways that people rely on for greatly reducing the risk of a sudden collapse. But, you know, that simply accelerates the process of getting the brine dissolution going and the
Right.
squeeze out process getting started there.
Okay. And the issue for Cayuga Lake is that the size of the mine to the lake is just much smaller than in normal conditions. So the brine leakage is likely to have a much more noticeable impact.
I'm saying that with respect to the Lake Erie and Lake Huron mines. You know, for other mines that are not under a body of water, you know, that calculus changes.
Okay.
You know, it's the threats to groundwater certainly exist. That is, or at least was, the contentious point about the closure and settlement, the financial settlement regarding the Axel Retzoff mine in the Geneseo area.
So that's a question. Should we be thinking about groundwater being impacted?
Well, you know, the early mining, before mining under the lake was started, the early mining was done, as I understand, under parts of Lansing, you know, on the east side of the lake. And, you know, flooding is already starting to happen in that area, as I understand. But the effects on groundwater are somewhat different from the effects on the open lake, I think.
I think a big concern would be just that Cargill just gives up and says goodbye, and we have no leverage or recourse.
That is a continuing concern from what I've heard, yes.
Another issue that we've run into is that we have a hard time getting any data. All their seismic data and whatnot is considered confidential, proprietary information. So it's really hard to have third-party investigation of these issues. So it really would have to be, you know, a forced hand by the DEC to have a thorough EIS.
And is there a role to be played by municipalities in advocating for a EIS? And how impactful might such a request be?
Well, I think if several municipalities were to submit comments on what we think is going to be coming as a result of the notice of incomplete application, one of the two handouts that I provided that Roxy sent out.
Right.
That, I think, provides an opportunity for any municipality that thinks a study, perhaps an EIS, is warranted. Definitely, if a few municipalities chimed in on that, I think it would greatly increase the chances that an EIS would be required by DEC.
Well, but a consortium of communities would probably be better than doing it separately, wouldn't it?
Well, from DEC's standpoint, I think either way would work, but certainly in terms of working together and making an easier process of it, understanding the issue well, probably a consortium would be a good way to go.
So do you think that would be something for CWIO to take on?
Well, I presented as something for municipalities to decide whether they thought was important, you know, in terms of their own community views and so on. But I certainly would not object to the idea of having a group of communities work on it through CWIO.
Yeah, I'd be happy to move this forward. And personally, one of the things that I needed to understand was more of the science behind it, to put it in context, to be able to make sound statements or requests to the regulators. So I appreciate all the information that you both brought today. It's very helpful to kind of understand what we're looking at. And we're looking at it regardless of what future actions happen. We need to understand so that we can make the best management choices and prepare.
Well,
Are
thank you
there
for
any-
your
Another
time
kind of-
today.
Go ahead, Stephanie.
One other sticky sort of subject that I've had in my own municipality is understanding that the Cargill salt has a state contract, so it's much cheaper to buy than other areas. And so I found that our DOT has been purchasing large amounts from Cargill. Most municipalities in New York State purchase their road salt from underneath our lake. So if you have any sway with your DOT, maybe suggest that they purchase elsewhere. But it is a hard topic because it is cheaper to buy through a state contract.
That's a good point. That's a good thing to know. And that's the kind of thing that CWIO can comment on at the state level for all of us. Like, so that puts municipalities in this difficult situation. We don't want to spend extra money that maybe we don't have a lot of for salt to get elsewhere, but we don't want to contribute to our own demise potentially. And the state's creating that difficult situation. So we could reference that. Yes, Tom, I see your hand.
You're muted, Tom.
Just to elaborate on Stephanie's point, 2 points. New York State uses more salt per road mile than any other state. And secondly, especially here in the Adirondacks, where I'm speaking from, it has devastating effects on surface waters. And so there's a statewide task force, as I understand it, to look at alternatives to road salting.
That is a great segue into giving a plug for our Cayuga Lake Summit, which will be July 16th at Stewart Park at 6:30. We have 2 sessions. The first session will be from somebody that was very involved in the Adirondack Road Salt Task Force, and he helped draft a lot of the best management practices for that task force report. He was actually an industry guy, and so he was one of the largest purchasers of road salt for private owners such as Wegmans parking lots and things like that. And then he had a really epiphany moment where he realized how much damage road salt was actually doing to our ecology. And he has since sort of pivoted and tried to really reduce road salts. And he's actually found that he's had that these best management practices have had a really great impact. They've reduced salt for municipalities by a minimum of 50%, sometimes up to 80%. And so aside from the ecological aspects, there's an environmental or economic aspect of that too. Our second part of the panel, our second part of our discussion will be a PFAS discussion. And we're going to have people from the Helbling Lab at Cornell presenting the data they've collected over the last year. We'll also have a couple of people that are managers at Seneca Meadow. And so they'll be talking about their PFAS management of their leachate. And we'll be having other people on that panel that have collected environmental data regarding PFAS. So it should be a really robust discussion. So that's July 16th at Stewart Park at 6:30.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was a great segue. Also in the chat from, yes, go
good.
ahead.
No,
Okay,
I was just going Same thing.
Yeah.
Go
Margaret Johnson has put in the chat here too that Assembly Person Annis Kellis and Senator Rachel, Webb have a bill S7736B and A8250A. I sort of butchered that. Look in the chat if you want that.
You're doing fine, Roxy.
We could also, municipalities and CWIO could write a letter of support for passage of that legislation. Is there,
The Senate.
what's the,
It passed the Senate, but it did not pass the Assembly due to a backlog of bills at the end of their session. So
so it's
yeah,
a next year? kind
hopefully by
thing?
next year, the Assembly will pass it and we'll get it in front of the governor.
Yeah,
So-
actually, it will have to pass the Senate again next year, so your advocacy in the Senate's not wasted. And we are anticipating a special session in September. It would be very exciting if this could be on the agenda for that. So it's not too early to start weighing in on this one.
Okay, okay. Well, I can put together a letter for CWIO to consider. Are there
CWIO did
any,
a
go ahead.
resolution on this bill, which was fabulous. And then it was really quiet. We didn't hear from locals much.
Oh,
So that would especially help in the Assembly where the bill did not pass.
okay. Okay. All right, are there any other questions for Ray or Stephanie? Stephanie will probably stay. Ray doesn't, you're welcome to stay, right, for the whole meeting if you want. We're super fun people, but we also understand if you don't want to. Any other questions?
Got another meeting at 6:30, so I may not stay too long, but
We'll be done
Thank
by
you.
then.
Thank you
Thank-
for all your good information.
Yeah,
thank you for your time.
thank you.
Goodbye, all. Thank you.